Our next session also has to do with coaches. It's a little bit different. It's when cops are coaches. And we're asking the questions: if more police became youth sports coaches, could barriers be reduced to regain some level of trust between police and communities of color? An HBO Sports Fox Media Studios documentary recently explored the benefits of midnight basketball, one of the first sport-based youth development programs and a crime prevention tool as well. Let's take a look.
My childhood years, my teenage years, were in the 80s and 90s, and that directly connects to the crack epidemic, some of the most violent times in Chicago. Around my neighborhood, we had to kind of create our own sports arenas because we didn't have them there. You see all the nails? Those are the rims. That's where we put the rims up. So as we grew up, look, here's an even piece of crate. Look at that.
I need a nice sprint now.
With the idea of co-founding Westside Sports, we want to provide out-of-school positive programming for young people so that they have a place to go to stay safe.
Most important, have fun, okay?
Here to moderate this panel is John Solomon, the editorial director for Project Play. John?
Thanks, Sebastian. Appreciate it. Really excited to be here with two people who are really thinking outside the box when it comes to the cops as coaches model. First, we have with us Jermaine Harris, who we just saw in the clip. Jermaine is a sergeant in the Chicago Police Department and co-founder of Chicago Westside Sports. And we're also pleased to have Nekia Kemp, and Nekia is executive director of the Buffalo Police Athletic League. Thanks so much for being here. Also, audience, so you know, we will be doing some audience Q&A at the end of this session, so go to Slido and submit any questions that you want. First, let's start by talking about what community policing really means. Jermaine, what does that definition mean? Because it's used quite a bit, and how can it relate to youth sports?
Yeah, to really understand this topic, community policing turns into somewhat of a buzzword. So before I start, I know there are some other police athletic leagues. I know I see over there the Detroit PAL. This great work is happening in so many places across the country, right? So these are examples that we're doing it, but not to, forget that so many officers are doing this type of work. And so I really get to this point of community policing is really about solving problems, right? Not so much of the idea of hosting events and taking photos and doing these different type of activities, but it's really about this long-term, consistent engagement with our community in order to solve problems. And one of those key points is, Candace talked about from the NBA in a previous panel, she used this word that I really want to uplift. She talked about communal, and she talked about how when she played sports, it was her neighbors and so many people that she knew. So really an understanding the community policing concept is that how do we use these assets, these great, amazing leaders and relationships that exist in our communities to reduce crime and effectively solve problems?
And you're doing that some with Chicago Westside Sports. Explain a little bit your three-pillar model, which is really interesting.
Yeah. So it is a asset-based program. So the idea is we thought of what are these kind of consistent, long-term institutions that are in disinvested communities? What stays and holds over time? Businesses leave, different type of companies come and go, but there are some institutions, one being police, right? We are there consistently. So one member of our teams comes from policing, whether that's Chicago police, whether that's our county police, or even do some work with federal officers. The other piece of that three-legged stool is our church community, our faith-based leaders. And then that third piece is our nonprofit partners, right? And so coming together, not only are we supporting youth, but we're also supporting that collaboration, because as I'm coaching with you and we're going through these struggles and trying to get these wins, we're also building amazing relationships. And out of that translates into so many other spaces that we're able to be successful in.
Nekia, as a police athletic league, your model is based totally on police having to coach youth. What benefits have you seen for the community and maybe even for police, hopefully as well, by coaching kids in sports?
I think a lot of what we've seen is just building that relationship of community. As Jermaine mentioned, really looking at how this community operates, how police officers are actually just your neighbors, your friends. In Buffalo, New York, we have a policy where police officers have to live in the city of Buffalo. So they do live in the city of Buffalo. And one of our programs, Play Streets, that we launched right before the pandemic was one of those programs where we went into communities, we knocked on doors, we had people come outside and just engage in sports activities. And that was so important. What we started to see with working with an outside evaluator and really surveying the community was that the community felt more comfortable with the police. There was a lot of social unrest. There was a lot of issues with police officers, especially in the city of Buffalo, and being able to knock on doors and say, we just want to play kickball. We just want to get you out and play kickball. We want to give you some sporting equipment to keep for yourself. You can have at home, but we also want to build these relationships and just play a game. All of a sudden, it went from 5 kids in a park to 50 kids, and then their parents participating, us playing kickball and volleyball in the community. So I think from both ends, when you look at the community policing piece and you look at the community piece, I think it's something that the community needed and continues to need at that time to really heal and understand what's happening and how we can better work together to have a safer community. Because at the end of the day, we want our kids to feel safe playing in parks, in neighborhoods, and we also want them to not be in a house shelter because they're afraid to come out, but we also want them to know that the police officers, not all police officers are bad police officers. They're here to really support and help.
For either of you, is that difficult building that trust back? Like, what's the reaction when police officers knock on the door for Play Streets? Hey, come outside and play, but you're seeing police officers, you may be used to a different connotation of what a police officer means if they're knocking at your door.
Oh, absolutely. It was very difficult. It was very difficult at first. And what we used was the power of social media, the power of putting videos out, the power of showing the kids having fun, the power of parents engaging with police officers and asking questions. The police officers talking to the youth and laughing with teenagers and being competitive in giant kickball games and just laughing at them running around and just having a good time and putting those positive images out through the media, because all we saw at that time was negative, 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 and we had to change the narrative in order to make our community happy, healthier, and safe.
Let's talk about policy a little bit. Jermaine, you're sergeant in Chicago Police Department. How do you get police officers to volunteer and to work? What do those relationships look like?
Yeah, so one of the challenges with this type of work is that there aren't clear defined policies, right, mandates on how this work happens, right? Community policing is so valuable and such a useful tool, but in spite of that, we still don't really have consistent themes about how we're gonna go about building trust, right? How do we go about getting to these points? How do we go about achieving equity? Like, how do we do these things specifically as a clear-cut way? It's still missing. So quite often, much of it is relationships, right? It's me going to an officer who I see might have experience as a coach or who does really great work with young people and making that personal ask of, hey, I think you'll be great at this, you should do it. And going to leadership, making these handshake deals about, hey, this is a really great program, convincing our leadership to invest in it. And it's been successful, but I worry that if I'm not there to do that, how does it stay consistent, right? What is the legacy of a program like Chicago Westside Sports when we don't have the policy, required to show the value of these things? And I could equate that to Sro and explain, right? We understand how most of the time police are celebrated, right? You catch a bank robber or you make some huge bust, there's a medal and award ceremony and all of this fanfare, right, for that type of activity. But how does that look when you're doing something like this, where the results aren't gonna be immediate, you're not gonna see it today, but in 10 years, 15 years, it starts to transform a community because of those relationships you've created with police. So if you all get a chance to see that documentary, with Midnight Basketball, you'll see that 2 of our current officers played in Midnight Basketball. That investment that they did in the 90s that was made into them then is paying off right now that they're also coaches doing the same exact thing. So these are long-term, solutions that require these long-term investments. And right now, the policy's missing to make that happen, and that is absolutely what's needed.
So how do we change that? Because right now, I think, look, crime is up across the country some. So the idea from a lot of police departments and mayors let's throw more police onto the streets, as opposed to maybe some more proactive measures such as this. How do you convince your bosses, Nekia, how do you convince the people who are higher up than you that this is a preventative measure and we need to have funding, but to your point, you may not see immediate results?
So one of those big things is really glad too that we had Rhonda and Kyle come up and they talked about ARPA and they talked about all this money, right, that's being put into this type of work and being put into communities. I can take my own state, for example. From ARPA, we're expected to get $25 billion, right? Our governor just passed a Reimagined Public Safety Act in which from our state, is devoting $250 million towards violence prevention. That's part of a $507 million portfolio that's related to violence prevention, youth employment, and diversion programs. My city, Chicago, invests $50 million in community-based violence prevention, right? So when we look at it, that it's not so much of a resource problem. It's becoming a relationship problem right now. And so in thinking about and understanding how do you build relationships, we need to find some way to reach common ground. And one of those is the power of sports. A basketball, a football, a baseball is a universal language.
The great unifier.
You start off with that space, everybody gets it. And so from that space, that common ground, we can start to build on and we can start to move in those directions. And so it's really an understanding that these are these first initial steps to get us where we need to be. And if we don't do first things first, we're going to be in this same rut. We're going to be in these same positions for years as we've seen so far.
Nekia, do you see the same? Is it finances
that is very
or is it
true
relationships?
when you talk about funding and policy. We're really fortunate in that we have a mayor that is very strong and believes in this type of work in community policing. We have a police commissioner that stands behind. They created a unit in 2020 called the Neighborhood Engagement Team, and that is their sole role. That is their role, to engage the community. And in a lot of other communities, you don't see that, where there's a dedicated specific amount of funds that goes directly to working in community policing. And I think it has to start with the policymakers above that. I think we have a unique situation where you talk about the PALs across the country, where you have a lot of them are nonprofit agencies, so we're able to raise money, apply for grants, do different things to be able to bring resources and combine with the police department in order to make it work. But it is going to take a lot of policy at a higher level of looking at how can we reduce crime across the board. And one way to do that is you're going to have to invest in data. You're going to have to count the numbers. You're going to have to show that this type of work is effective, that it's actually reducing crime, that areas that we're working in, specific areas, we actually use data that inform us on where we go as far as targeted programming, and to be able to work in that specific area and say, okay, we know that there's an issue with youth issues or delinquencies or higher crime or car break-ins. Why don't we infiltrate this area and work on this area and be able to show that in data and crime statistics? And I think that's what's going to happen across the board, is that you're going to have to tell the story in numbers in order to receive the funding for people to really buy into this being a solution to a very real problem.
So are there many people doing that research? Does that data exist much out there or no?
If there's any researchers out here, we can absolutely use some support in that. But we do some informal surveying of our youth who participate in the program, right? Because we do want to show that efficacy. We want to show that this does matter. So in looking at crime data, specifically looking at violence, in those spaces, so with Chicago Westside Sports, we operate year-round, and a lot of it is about activating existing spaces, right? It's not a building. We don't have a facility. We go into places in the community and bring in the relationships and bring in the volunteers and the people and the attention to try and leverage Chicago Police Department's name, right? Leverage that legitimacy to help, invite and get people involved. But what we see in those spaces that we activate, it drastically reduces violence. Because when we're not using a park or we're not taking advantage of that space, that's when negative elements will fill in. But positive energy is infectious, And people who are up to no good don't want to be near that type of activities. So as we activate these spaces, we can see through data that it makes a huge difference, right? And not only that area on that night, but it has a residual effect, right? Because these spaces are now known, these parks become family spots, right? So we can show that. And the other piece is the impact it's having on our relationships between community and police. So Chicago is, we're infamous in a lot of ways, right? When we talk about relationships between police and community, specifically police in the Black community. That's a lot of history and damage that needs to be prepared. But we talk to and we survey not only the youth who play in the sport, but also the family who is connected and involved, to ask them, does their viewpoint change about policing just by participating in a 3-month season? And 2 out of 3 changed their viewpoint on policing from negative to positive just in those 3 months of having these practices. So as we build on that, it starts to grow and it starts to build, and it starts to create this movement and this true transformation, right? But it does need that serious, some serious analysis, some serious studying on it to really figure out what are those best practices, how do we replicate it and really take this to scale? Because I'm working in a few communities in Chicago, but I'm nowhere near serving as many kids that are of need, right? And we really need to scale and be able to grow larger.
Right. As a reminder, if you have any questions, you can submit it on Slido, sli.do, and use the hashtag #PPSummit. Let me ask you all both about, are the police officers who need this interaction with the community the most, are they volunteering? Are they the ones coaching kids in sports, Nekia, or are we not getting the right police officers?
Oh, absolutely. I think we were just talking about this earlier that, we have a lot of young recruits. We have a lot of new recruits. We've done a lot of diversity and recruitment for officers being a part of the force. And just like anyone else, when they go to work, they want to make it home safely. And so this is an opportunity for them to build those relationships. What we started to see, as you were saying earlier, is that even the community now is willing to come forth with information on crimes because they feel the comfort level there. They feel a little bit more comfortable that they want their community to be safer. And I think making those connections are huge. So yeah, I think a lot of the officers, again, are looking at this as saying, I'm here, I want to do my job. I want to do it the right way. I want to serve this community that I live in, but also making sure that they have built those relationships with those families and those kids in that area because they do want to be safe and they do want to come home to their families.
And if I can add just one more piece, right, about this benefit. So when we talk about youth sports, right, we immediately think of the youth, right, the benefit that it comes to serving young people. But there's a lot of people that benefit from this experience, and I'll share myself personally. So I've been a police officer for 19 years, and around the 4 or 5 year mark, personally for me, I had enough of it, right? Just constantly seeing these negative things that are going on. I'm constantly around, murder and violence and abuse, and it plays a heavy toll on you psychologically. And I was fortunate enough that my son, who's 5 years old, became old enough to play t-ball baseball. And being out there as a dad, all dads know when you show up more than 2 or 3 times, you are now a coach. So being there with that experience, kind of being sucked into that, it allowed me to be able to step outside of the negative world that really was consuming me and see what life is really like, right? So I got to be in the community that I served, where I was a police officer, and I got to coach kids who were doing the exact opposite of what I saw at a 911 call. Laughing, playing, family, friends, all of those things, and it brought so much balance to me. And so now moving kind of fast forward to now my son's 18, right, and he doesn't need me to coach him anymore. And now there's an opportunity that experience that I got that helped provide balance in my life, Chicago Westside Sports provides that for other officers. So they're there supporting community, but at the same exact time, they're getting a balance in their lives that help keep them sane, right? It helps support their mental health and mental wellness. And that's so important. And we're one of those benefits that we don't always recognize.
That's great. Is it challenging, Jermaine, to recruit these police officers, or a lot of them signing up and they want to do this?
It's a little bit. Like, one of those things is getting them to take that first plunge and step, right? It's a fearful thing. Kids are scary. It's like coaching a kid in those type of sports it's nervous, right, to do something like that. That's a big deal. But once they go ahead and take that plunge and step out there, they get addicted. And now every season they're like, put me down, sign me up, and it's like, we got to get someone else a turn. But it's just the challenge becomes in getting them to take that first step, right? And that push and that nudge is what's the obstacle, what the obstacle is.
Yeah. Let's go back to the government's role and policy. Nekia, what more can government do to try to promote this model, to try to have a more preventative model out there of police as coaches?
I definitely agree with being more proactive than reactive, which is what a lot of communities are now, is when something happens, we got to put in a program to fix it. And so I think looking at, from a top level down, again, really putting resources and funding to these type of initiatives, and not just resources and funding. You really touched on the social, emotional, and mental health aspect of it, being able to look at that piece as well. So I think definitely putting some funding towards this initiative, but also professional development and training. We work with a lot of coaches, we work with a lot of volunteers, a lot of police officers, and you can't, again, we talked about this earlier, you can't coach a 5-year-old like you would coach a 12-year-old. So being able to offer professional development within those guidelines so that they are just as effective as anyone else at being able to deliver the programs that we need them to deliver. And
Jermaine, to train police officers as coaches, what does that entail with your program?
So much of one of the side effects, the unfortunate of disinvestment in so many different spaces, police officers now wear so many hats, many of which we shouldn't, right, when it comes to a lot of the work that we get called out. But there's a benefit to that training, is that it does raise our awareness and our capabilities, right? So now when it gets into this point of being a coach, some of the things that we do around being trauma informed, right, being able to address and deal with crisis intervention, those are extremely valuable tools, right? And so as we coach, it's important to understand that it's not really about trying to win the game, right? We keep hearing that so much, right? That's great and all to celebrate, but in the end, only one team can win, right? But out of that process, so many others can win as well. And when we get caught into a little bit of this space of trying to serve or cater the most elite of the group, that less than 1%, 99.99% of kids get left out of that process, right? And so really in understanding that and helping the officer coach, the community coach, the faith-based coach, everyone really be on that same page and speak that same language, that universal language of developing and supporting our youth. I think that's one of the things that helps us get to another level, because we are putting a lot of those social emotional aspects first.
It's true. It's not always about the rules of the game. Yeah. You could say we can take anybody and you could be a soccer coach if you've never played soccer before, because there's so many other different components to the game of what we're doing, and that's youth development.
We're going to move to some audience Q&A now. Again, if you have any questions, you can go into Slido. Let's see our first question. Do you require that coaches, officers be from the community they're serving, and have you seen that kind of relationship help or hurt in any way? Nekia, you want to start first?
All right, to speak on that, well, I was just kind of thinking about, I'll go super quick so you have time. So one of these things we understand is, like, so much of we try to provide sport is like, how do we provide a program, or how do we create an organization? Like, how do we do these type of things to go into a community and help that community? What we do within this process, in this model, really is, how do we serve those members of that community to provide these opportunities for themselves? That is capacity building. That's true transformation, right? That it doesn't require me, right, to hold my finger in the dam, right, to stop the flow, that it can maintain itself. So when we talk about being asset-based, the officers who coach, the community partners who coach, the faith-based community that coach, it's all local. And what we found in this process, when the pandemic took toll and when everyone was forced to stay home, our coaches, their home was there at the park. their home was in those locations. So we were able to run a complete program throughout the pandemic. We never shut our doors. We were able to still have our baseball season in the summer of 2020 because the assets, the people who were involved, lived in that space. And so we are definitely very intentional about ensuring that everything is local and able to access and be connected to the youth.
And Nekia, how about for you? Police officers, are they local in where they're serving?
Oh, absolutely. Just like I said, these are neighborhood engagement officers live in the communities that they serve, so they are there. One of the big pieces of the puzzle to all of this is these officers are building relationships that will have residual effects for generations. I mean, we've had generational damage of relationships with police officers. And when you look at the fact that we're able to go in and change that perception of a 5-year-old or a 25-year-old or a 60-year-old. We've had seniors come out and participate in programming and then realize, wow, I would have never come out and played a kickball game or a volleyball game or a game of soccer or even had a conversation with you had you not been in this park engaging at that time. And I also think it's really important to mention the community partners and the faith-based community, because without having all community partners at the table and all working together to wrap around those services in that community would be a disservice. We're only able to do what we do because of the community partnerships that we build across the board, because we are a youth sports organization that provides camps, clinics, and leagues. That's what we do. And with that, we offer some academic support, but there are agencies that offer mental health services, agencies that offer food security. We had to partner with all of those agencies in order to say, guess what? We've got 400 kids coming to this or 200 kids coming to this park. Why not have the truck come up and give out free food? Why not have, mental health services there? So being able to kind of leverage all of those different partners in order to make it work is really important.
And one last question. What impact have you seen on police officers from their participation in the program? For example, are officers applying more of a trauma-informed approach?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I'll let you speak to it because you're the officer, but absolutely. And then we have been able to partner to offer trauma-informed training for volunteer coaches, for police officers, so that we're all speaking the same language. All of our programs are rooted in restorative practices and restorative justice. So that's happening in the school day, it's happening in the after-school programs, it's happening in sports programs, it's happening on the weekends when they're in church and they're in other communities. So really taking that approach and offering that professional development of trauma-informed care and restorative practices, and being able to say we all have a common language on how we resolve conflict and resolve issues, and then we're able to really work together, and these kids learn it early on, very early on.
And Jermaine, are you seeing an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. Direct benefits to this process. Our coaches are also receiving, different type of training to help them become better at coaching. But so much of the power of sports translates outside of the field, right? These concepts of teamwork, leadership, these things work no matter where you are. You're in a boardroom, on the field, being a police officer, it doesn't matter. These are effective. And so one of those things that becomes very important for the police officer, even when it comes to these issues that we deal with, such as use of force, right? This knowing of a person, our relationship, for me and you to know each other, for us to have this common ground, when we make encounters, when we have encounters, right, that may be hectic or may be some sort of issue, the fact that we have a relationship to begin with helps us de-escalate, helps us not need to use force, helps us to find these alternative ways to address and deal with problems. And so it plays out in so many other different ways. And I think it's really important that we highlight, right? We highlight the effect of that to let departments know, let policymakers know, to understand that if we want to reduce these issues of use of force, if we want to make this impact around crime prevention, it starts with allowing officers, promoting officers to create relationships, providing the opportunity and the time to create long-term, consistent relationships and not just, you know, hodgepodge, pop here and there, in and out, but being consistent, right, within that process.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much. We really appreciate this. This is a terrific conversation. It's a great opportunity to use police as coaches. Yes, please give them a round of applause.